Hi, welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social issues affecting women, family, children, and diverse communities. This week we have the pleasure of speaking with author Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's written several books about immigration, Islam, and women's rights. And now she has a new book out called Prey, P-R-E-Y, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. So welcome, Ayaan. Great to see you again. We've interviewed you for several of your other books. Always an impressive guest. I'm going to ask you about why the title, but first, before we get to that, for members of our audience who don't know your background, where you come from, what you went through because of Islam, and how you escaped to the West, so to speak, please tell your background to our audience.
Well, Bonnie, thank you very much for having me on. It's a great pleasure to see you again. So my name is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and I was born in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1969. And I lived there for about 7 or 8 years when my family moved to Saudi Arabia, and then we moved to Ethiopia, and then we moved to Kenya, where I lived for about 11 years. And then I escaped my family because my father arranged a marriage for me with a man I didn't want to be married to. So I left, when I left Kenya, I went to Germany so that a relative could arrange my immigration paperwork. But instead of staying there, I took the train from Germany to the Netherlands and I asked for asylum. And that was back in 1992. I was there for 14 years. And I'm very grateful to that country because I found a lot of opportunities to improve my position as an individual, as a woman. And then finally, I ended up coming to the United States in 2006, and I've been here ever since.
And you did manage to escape an arranged marriage, but you didn't escape FGM as a child, correct?
I did not escape FGM because, unfortunately, back then that was the norm, and it still is the case. According to the United Nations World Health Organization, the rate of children's little girls being subjected to FGM, that's female genital mutilation, is at 97 or 98%. So, unfortunately, it's still the norm.
All right, now let's get to your book, Prey, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Tell me how those things are all related, please.
They are related because there are about, I would say, the majority of immigrants coming into Europe come from Muslim majority countries. And of those immigrants, again, a great majority, 2/3 of them, or even over 2/3, are men, young men. Now, not all of these young men engage in sexual misconduct against women or any kind of violence, but a number does, and that number is large enough to cause trouble on the streets of several European countries to women. So I've spoken to, as you'll see in the book, I've spoken to women, European women, but also immigrant women. But what is special about the European women is that they were not used to the public space being unsafe for them. And now that is the case in many neighborhoods. And the source of that insecurity or unsafety, it's immigrant men who came as asylum seekers and as recently as the year 2015, but some of them are the children of first-generation immigrants, so they are born and raised there. And so when it comes to attitudes towards women, we are seeing a real conflict of values playing itself out on the streets of Europe. And sometimes that is justified in the name of religion, Islam in this case, or when the Muslim leaders are spoken to and asked, why are these men behaving like this and what can you do to stop it? They say, well, the solution to the problem is for the women to cover themselves and stay at home and stay out of the way of these young men.
So the West, as you know, has a pretty awful history of colonizing and cruelty, and of course, before that, slavery of persons of color. And people in the West are very delicate about religion. Do you think they're wrong in being that way? Do you think they're in denial about changes that are taking place in their own societies?
I think Western leaders and Western intellectuals are absolutely right. They're doing the right thing and a good thing to reflect on their history, the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of the Holocaust. Western civilization has generated a great deal, I must say, to reflect on. Some of it is really bad. Slavery, colonization, all of that was really, truly bad, and it's fantastic to reflect on that. But Western civilization has also done some really very good things that we're all benefiting from. In fact, as a civilization, it's the only one that does engage in a critical reflection on the past. And I applaud that too. What I'm against, and I think many other women are, is for Western leaders to use the history and the narrative of what went wrong in the past to do nothing about what is going wrong now, or to justify incompetence and lack of leadership around the issues of women, Islam, and unmanaged immigration, because bad things happened in history.
So you're saying there was one night of violence in Western Europe, and as you mentioned, that several women were attacked, and it really, like the attack on the U.S. Capitol in January, it seemed to have been organized in some way. How did that happen? What do you think went wrong with Western culture that it was allowed to happen? Was there anything the governments could have done to prevent it?
Yes, so I think the first thing is to say it cannot in any way be compared to what happened on the Capitol in the United States on January the 6th. It wasn't a contest of power, and I think the men may have come across, the men who attacked the women may have come across as organized, but I think there was no organization behind it. But what happened was a large number of men from Muslim majority countries on New Year's Eve 2015, 2016 went out and started to encircle women who were celebrating that event and attack them and rob them and violate their sexual rights. They tried to rape them, they groped them, they tried to put their fingers in between the women's legs and on their breasts and so on. And many women reported that. Now, the response from the leadership was, well, it's an unfortunate incident. It should not have happened. 660 women reported to the police what had happened to them. It led to less than 50 convictions. Actually, not even convictions. I think only 50 of them were taken seriously. I have to look at my notes. But that event is an illustration of what is wrong with the approach and the attitude that European leaders take to this issue of clashing values between some Muslims, some Muslim men who, when they come to Europe, violate the laws, the norms, and the customs of Europe. And the victims of those violations, such as women. And it is not enough for these leaders to say that their ancestors did some bad things in history, and therefore it's an excuse for them to do nothing.
So what do you want them to do? And bearing in mind that I have, over many years, since actually the mid-90s, I have traveled to a lot of Middle Eastern countries, North African countries, and done stories about women and Islam. And what most of the women will say about having to cover up and being subservient to their husbands is that when they have to wear the garments, they see it as giving them power, and they see themselves as, you know, as getting power as opposed to being stripped of power. What do you say to those women? And I've always been, quite frankly, very surprised by some of these arguments, given their situations in the world.
In the Middle East, in countries where Islamic norms and values and laws are the prevailing norms and values and laws, it is true that if you are a woman and you don't cover yourself, you will get into trouble, big, bad trouble. So when they tell you, as an outsider, we have to cover ourselves because if I'm covered, I have less constraints of movement on me, that makes sense. It's a practical way of adapting to their own reality. But when you go to the streets of France and Germany and Sweden, and you're talking to European women who are used to dressing as they please and going wherever they wanted in the assumption that they are safe in the public square, that's a different story. Now, those women are being told by some of their leaders that, in fact, they do have to adapt to the new reality, that you have to think about what you wear. You have to think about where you go out and where you walk. You have to think about whether you're going out alone at night or not. You have to think about how you're going to behave and what kind of threat you're going to face before you leave your front door. That development is new in Europe. I mean, when I say new, I'm talking about modern Europe, not 19th century Europe, not even the 1950s Europe, but relatively new in the 21st century for these women. And this is has direct correlation with immigration from Muslim majority countries. And that's what these leaders need to address.
So what do you think, how should the leaders address this? How should immigration be changed?
Well, first of all, they have to acknowledge that there is a problem, that there are a clash of values, that now women in large numbers have become victims, not just immigrant women, but also European women. So that acknowledgement will then lead to the next step, which is an honest assessment of the problem and how big it is. And once that is done, what will follow are programs that compel these young men who engage in these acts of misconduct and violence against women to be assimilated into the norms, the prevailing norms of the countries that they have chosen to settle in. There should be consequences for those who refuse to do that. And those consequences can't be just a slap on the wrist, as is the case in many of these countries where either they're acquitted or they get 2 weeks, just a few weeks of probation or community work. Or, the punishment has to fit the crime. So the message that the institutions and the leadership of Europe right now, the message they are conveying to the immigrant men who engage in misconduct is that they can carry on. There'll be no consequences. And that is what I'm trying to bring to the surface and start a conversation about in this book, Pray.
Now, do you see the same? We, of course, here in the U.S. have just had a huge conversation about immigration and a change of administrations, largely due to divisions within the country about how much immigration, what kind of immigration we should be having in this country. Do you see the same thing, as you say in the title of your book, the erosion of women's rights in the U.S. that you see in Europe?
What I see is that the conversation about immigration and on immigration in the United States is radically different from the conversations that they're having in Europe. And the reason why it's different is, first of all, America has always been an immigration country. And American immigration has always been selective. And the conversations, if you listen closely, between the conservatives and the liberals, between the Republicans and the Democrats, is not about whether there should be immigration or not. It's very much about what kind of immigration. Who do we let in and who do we keep out, and how? That's what the Americans are debating and disagreeing on, and I think at some point we're going to have, hopefully, a resolution.
Well, because of what you've seen in Europe, do you suggest in the book that there should be some kind of limit or a limit put on young Islamic men coming out of poverty in countries where there's social turmoil, or should there be a questionnaire that they have to answer or oaths that they have to swear to about how they will treat women in this country?
In my view, because I have been through the American immigration process, in my view, America has got all of these things. You are asked if you have committed prior crimes. You are asked when I was applying for the green card, and I'm not a man, I've even been asked if I'm HIV positive, I had to test for it. Or if I had TBC, I had to test for it. So before the immigration process and the kind of vetting that one goes through, starting from when you're outside of the United States to when you're allowed in on a visa and you proceed to a green card and you proceed to citizenship, all of that process is already in place. And because I have been through it, I know that it is of a different quality than what we are seeing in Europe. It's very different. And in America—
Okay, but how should it change? I mean, how would you screen for men who, in your view, would be likely to treat women in ways that are not acceptable in Western culture, but are very acceptable in Islamic culture? I'm just trying to see where you draw the line.
So in America, that kind of selection is already in place. You already get questions about whether you have committed crimes, and sexual misconduct against women, so rape, is a crime, and you have to answer truthfully. And if in America they find out that you are telling lies, there will be consequences. And then inside America, anybody, regardless of their religion or background, if they do commit such acts, are punished for a very, very long time. The punishments are incredibly severe. This book is very much about Europe, where none of these safeguards are in place. Yes, people are asked about, have you committed a crime and so on, but they know from the ground that there is almost no consequence for them. Europe,
for example, has had many female prime ministers. There's one in Germany now, of course, and which had a huge influx a couple of years ago anyway, more than 1 million Islamic migrants from North Africa whose countries were in great turmoil. And of course, women seem to have greater rights, one could argue, in some of these countries than American women do. So do you think they're going to feel a backlash, a change in, other than like what you just described about women's rights being taken back because they can't go freely wherever they want to go at night, and they used to be able to. Do you see this changing European culture?
I want to say to you, paradoxically, it is, in fact, now with so many women, heads of state, Chancellor Angela Merkel, and when these 2015 incidents were happening, Theresa May was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And so the fact that things have evolved in Europe and in Western society, that it is okay and pretty normal now to have women in leadership places hasn't, and I repeat this, it's a paradox and it's an irony, that in fact the deterioration of the safety and the rights of women in working class neighborhoods has never been worse for some of these people.
Nothing you've said here today strikes me as radically conservative. You are very compassionate. You care about the rights of impoverished women, Islamic women, women of color. So why does the left, if I may use the word, dislike you so much? Why do feminists think that you are, extremely far right and not good for women?
Well, because I think my work is caught up, because it is my work that they dislike, but it is caught up in the ideology of the far left. It's the group of people who now call themselves woke. And that group of people, the woke, they don't dislike me because of my person, but they dislike me because my work goes against their orthodoxy.
Where and how does this happen?
Where and how does this happen? The ideology of woke, I don't know how much of it you are familiar with, but they do see our society, the United States of America, only through the prism of power, those who oppress and those who are oppressed. They see Black people, people of color, immigrants, as those who are oppressed and as victims. And they see white people, especially the white male heterosexual, as the oppressor. That's their ideology and that's their worldview. And anyone who goes against that, to them, is demonized. Now, that doesn't apply for the rest of the left. I'm very good friends with people who are center left. I call them sane left. And very good friends with people who are conservatives, who are center right. I don't think that conservatives are not compassionate. I think many of them are, in fact, very, very compassionate. But if you look at the world and at our society through this lens, this orthodoxy of critical theory, critical race theory, woke ideology, cancel culture, I think you're going to see everything warped. So I don't care what those people think about me. I think we're all in the same boat, because whether it's you or me, when you go against their worldview, they will try and cancel you. They'll try and come after you. They'll try and smear you. That's what they've done. But I mean, to me, they're not relevant. They're a distraction, because the problems that we are addressing, these encounters between people who are coming from places that are not safe, that are in turmoil and are looking to better and improve, I'm absolutely a proponent of that. But it cannot be, again, at the price and at the cost of the safety and the lives of others, especially people in the receiving or host societies, because we need them to continue to host. We need them to continue to receive people who are in turmoil. And for you to make that case, and for me to make that case, then we have to address, again, those negative unintended consequences before everything blows out of control.
Thank you so much, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a well-read author with a loyal following. And we really appreciate talking to you about your most recent book, Pray, Islam, Immigration, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Best of luck to you. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And please go to our PBS website, which is www.tothecontrary.org. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.